Okay, students of topics in British and American culture. Here we are again. This is part 3 of this week's lecture in order to give you some more manageable sized lectures. First of all, I want to say something about how this course is reflected in the textbook, because some of the things that I've been telling you this week are not really in the textbook, and that is because I was rushed in the first edition and in the second, and I can't talk about everything, but this is something that I feel needs to be updated. So in the third edition, all this stuff will make its way into the textbook, but right now, a lot of it is not. So what I talked about last week, especially we're approaching page 100 right now. Today we're going to cover to the end of chapter 3, right? And chapter 4 is about colonial America, and then about the American Revolution. That's next week, okay? So what I need you to understand is that some of the stuff I'm talking about, again, remember to prioritize. Video lecture is the most important thing because I'm adding things to the course. I've learned a lot since I started teaching this course 4 years ago. My background is strongest in the 16th century, as I said, so that hasn't changed a whole lot. But this part has, and other parts have too. So the end of this British section, which is coming up, but we're going to briefly come back because the Industrial Revolution is going to be stuck in there before what would normally be the midterm. But we're not going to have a midterm this semester, so that will be in the update. You're going to get a file, as I said. You're going to have another video that is going to explain to you what's going on in terms of the rest of this semester, which we still have 8 weeks to go. Okay, so now that I've said that, today we're actually going to talk about stuff that is in the textbook. So the sections that I'm covering, it's from the end of the flowering of English literature on page 96, right at the bottom of page 97 through to the end of the chapter. We're not going to talk about Scotland very much, but we are going to mention at the very end of this lecture the Union, which occurs in 1707, which I neglected to put on the board, but that's one of those things you just have to remember. 1707 is the beginning of the United Kingdom. That is the union between Scotland and England that really creates what we call British culture, what we call Britain. Great Britain was just an idea, and it sort of came into existence when the Scottish Parliament barely voted in favor of uniting. But we're probably some of that's going to carry over into the Industrial Revolution, because Scotland is really important in the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So I'm not going to talk about Scotland a whole lot today. I did talk about them with the Scottish Wars of Independence already, and they are important, but I can't work them in effectively all the time. So we are going to focus on what happens. Scotland's going to come up multiple times, but really they're in relation to what happens with the crown in England and how they relate to the king himself. As I said, the King of Scotland and the King of England are the same person now. So, there is this weird two kingdoms, one king thing going on for this whole period, and that causes a lot of problems, in addition to other things. Now, I'm really pleased to announce that one student sent me a question which I feel needs to be addressed before we continue. He or she is a freshman, which is also nice. That a student I've never seen before. I have no idea what the student looks like, so I'm not saying that the student is my favorite now, but this is the kind of thing that makes professors happy, let's be honest. If you ask a good question, it just helps me improve the class, and it makes me feel like people care and they're interested in what I'm saying. If everybody's sleeping in the back of the class, honestly, I feel like, why am I here in the first place? So this is just nice to to receive. I don't need all of you asking questions all the time, obviously, but when I get a good question like this, this just kind of gives me some. It gives me some motivation to try and do a better job of delivering the material. So, this is what the student asked. The reason why I'm writing this email is to ask a question about the 5 issues that I took from Robert Buckles. I explained in the video that there were 5 issues, and especially at the sovereignty part, you said that the king starts to lose control. And is this indirectly related to Magna Carta? Thank you for reading this email. Super question. Obviously, this person is watching the lectures and actually paying attention, so it fills my heart, like I said. Does it directly relate to Magna Carta? No, not directly, but yes, you got the right idea. This is why Magna Carta becomes so important, and I will run out of time very quickly if I don't move on. But in the course of what I mentioned briefly to you about the timeline that's behind me, that's one of the things that Parliament uses to argue its case that the king does not have the right to make decisions independently, that he requires permission. He or she, because there are queens, we already had several of them, right? And there's going to be more later, up until the present day. But Queen Elizabeth may be the most important one. Queen Mary had a sort of short reign, but Queen Elizabeth sort of set, the precedent for the possibility of a queen. Regardless of whether it's a man or a woman, the power of the monarch, the king or the queen, has to be granted by the people. And the people are represented by Parliament, not by the king. This is the argument. So when we talk about the Civil War, we're going to have this dispute between Charles and the Parliament. Is basically, is Charles representing the people? Which in some ways he is. He's just as popular as Parliament in some ways. Or is Parliament, as a body, as a group of people, the part of the government that is connected to the people and is the power and the control in the hands of the people, or is it given by God to the leader? And by giving it to the leader, is it given to the leader's children next? And by the end of this century, freshman student who I really respect now, that is basically what we're talking about. Sovereignty is proven through what happens. It's basically de facto power becomes part of the Parliament, and it's related to the other 4 of the 5, right? If the king didn't need money, he wouldn't need to call Parliament. But the king constantly has money problems, so therefore he has to make concessions to the Parliament in order for these things to happen. That's a great question, and that's a great way for us to start to talk about the rest of the century. So let's get into it, because this is going to come fast and furious. Now remember, this list of kings, just listen to the main points of what I'm saying. Just remember, just like I did with the Romans and the Celts and the Germans, the Vikings, the Normans. You don't have to remember everything. You don't have to remember the dates. You don't have to remember Alfred fought the Danes in this day in this century. You don't have to know that. I just want you to know the main things. We talked about King James a little bit, so we're going to move on from him. King James dies in 1625. His son, Charles, becomes the king. He gets married to a French Catholic queen. So this is not popular amongst a people that have traditionally been at odds with the French. They continue to believe that actually the King of England is the King of France also. We talked only briefly about the 100 Years' War, but that was sort of the thing. It was all started by William, and William took over France and still had possession of Normandy, so northern France was part of his, under his power. but then eventually they lost it. But the kings and queens of France continued to say that England belongs to them because William was the Duke of Normandy and he was beneath the French king. And the kings of England continue to believe that the French are beneath them because they conquered most of France. And at one point, they were actually chosen and given the kingdom in the middle of the 100 Years' War. So Charles, unlike Queen Elizabeth and unlike James, his father, he actually thinks that he should rule more like Henry VIII and more like William. He believes that he has the divine right to be the ruler, and he doesn't have to listen to anybody. Basically, he has sovereign, like I said, that's the key word from the student's email, is he is sovereign. And so nobody can judge what he does because he's above everyone. He believes in the chain of being, with the king at the top and everybody else in their place. There's no such thing as this elected body, this group of people that's all at the same level that has power over him. That's breaking the chain of being, right? So this creates all these problems. He has chronic money problems, as I said, so he's not able to do the things that he needs to do. Part of this is because Parliament right away doesn't give him money to run his household. Right away, normally when the king or queen is elected, Parliament just gives them a lifetime allowance, you might call it, so to cover his household expenses, which if you're a king, you have a court and you have artists and musicians and food and queens and children and servants and diplomats and guards, right? Like you have people protecting you and everything. You got to pay for that. They don't give it to him right away. They're supposed to just do it, and they decide not to. And this immediately makes him angry, and he feels like he's disrespected. And this basically, I won't tell you all the details because I don't have time. But basically, this is the way he resents interference by anybody, especially Parliament, when they do things that he considers them automatic. Because he's the king, he should get them without any questions. And as soon as people don't give him what he expects, he almost tries to take revenge. And he tries to, rather than being like Queen Elizabeth, and James was good at compromise too. He just doesn't compromise. He just always takes the hard line. And instead of getting something, he ends up getting nothing. Right? So Charles ends up deciding that he can't deal with Parliament anymore, and there's all kinds of stuff. There's all kinds of events that happen, but essentially he can't deal with Parliament effectively, and they block him, and he blocks him. He blocks them, and he eventually becomes so unpopular in London that he has to leave. So he goes north towards Oxford. And he decides that what he has to do is he has to stick his standard in the ground, which is a flag with a symbol on it, and that he needs to gather his subjects to him, and he needs to take control of the kingdom by force. That's how he's going to protect his sovereignty, is that he's going to raise an army, and then he's going to make people listen to him. Parliament doesn't like this at all. Or what's left of Parliament. There are people that support him, but basically they leave and follow the king. So he kind of shoots himself in the foot, as he continuously does, because he takes all the supporters out of London and they all leave. So what's remaining in London? This is why the revolution happens, because all the radical people, all the people that don't like Charles, they're left in Parliament without any opposition. All the people are like, well, the king's gone and all his friends are gone, so let's vote everything we want to do against the king. So they do. So Parliament has access to all the trade, the ships, the ports, the equipment, the money. So even though Charles has some advantages at first, in the long run, he loses, because he doesn't have a chance when he can't pay people properly and he doesn't have possession of the important southeastern part of England. The whole southern part basically is out of his hands pretty quickly. So he doesn't have control of weapons, equipment, money, and these are the things that in food and trade. He doesn't have access to any of these things, so how's he gonna? He's not going to be able to fight very long. He can fight for a while, but he's going to run out of material essentially. So that's what happens. What you need to know is there is a guy who he's a cavalry commander. He's a Puritan. His name is Oliver Cromwell. And you can see King Charles here goes to 1649. The reason that he stops ruling at 1649, and he rules for a while, 24 years, which is a good chunk, but he was not ready to die. He was killed. He was executed. And again, the whole trial was sort of, I'm the king, you can't say anything about me, you can't charge me, I didn't do anything wrong, and you don't have any right, because the courts are below me and I'm above you. And so the only solution, really, he basically gives them no choice. Is like, either let me be the king and do everything I want, or kill me. And they choose to kill him. The guy who does that is Oliver Cromwell. He's obviously a very talented commander. He wins many battles. He's very controversial because during the interregnum, the period where there's no king, because they kill the king, he goes to Ireland, and if he doesn't command the massacres, he certainly presides over them, and he writes some pretty shocking, prejudiced, racist things. All of my friends in Ireland detest him. If you're Korean, you might say Oliver Cromwell is the English version of the Japanese, Kampaku, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So if you're not Korean, I apologize, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you're Korean, you know what I mean. Koreans hate Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He cut people's ears off and collected them, for example. He invaded Korea, and he destroyed Korea in his invasion. That's how Lee Sun-shin becomes a hero, by protecting the south coast of Korea from Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So if you want to have a parallel and compare Oliver Cromwell to anybody, I think that's as close as you're going to get. Irish people detest him, and they certainly don't think he should have a statue, and Koreans don't think that war shrines and statues of Hideyoshi should be everywhere, because they have the same sort of historical, perspective on it, which you need to understand. There are people that have tried to clean up Cromwell's image and say that he didn't have these, dark sides to him, but it's clear that he did. He is, in some ways, a very two-sided individual. He was a talented commander. He was a skilled administrator. There was nobody to challenge him. He was an absolute ruler, but he refused to be the king. This is one of the things, again, going back to the Magna Carta and everything, is he decided to become the Lord Protector, to create this new position. And the thumbnail for today's lecture is going to be the front of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, where he's the instrument of the kingdom. There's no king. You've created a state where he balances power. He's got a scepter in one hand and a sword in the other, and his body is made up of the people. So he's supposed to be a representative ruler. And this is the period, the only period where a republic comes into existence. And it's called the interregnum because there's no king. So they kill the king 1949, that's much later. 1649, Cromwell takes over he's basically in control for about 10 years. He dies. His son is not made of the same thing. The military starts to take control over everything. So the country is sort of leaderless. They have sort of the remnant, is called the rump. They have the remnant of the parliament sitting and making decisions, but the military has the real power. So nobody really knows. It's really, really unstable. That period ends when they decide to invite Charles II. So this is pretty shocking when I learned about this. There's something called the Restoration, where they went to all this trouble, went through all this revolution, and then they decided they didn't like it, and the solution was to invite the son of the king that they killed to come back. Now, when he comes back, obviously, he could have killed a lot of people and punished a lot of people, but generally he lets a lot of people slide. He definitely kills some people because they deserve it, but he could have gone pretty crazy and killed all these, Puritans mostly, who pushed things too far. Oliver Cromwell's government even canceled Christmas. Like, you can't get more somber and boring and less fun than canceling everybody's favorite holiday, at least where I come from. Even Koreans like Christmas. It's why would you cancel that? Everybody wants the day off, and Puritans are like, no day off, no turkey, there was no turkey at that time, but no good food, no Christmas pudding, no presents, no drinking, just open your shop like it's a regular day. You can imagine why that didn't last very long. Pretty much everybody, 95% of the population was like, hey, you do what you want internationally. You start a war with another country, we don't care, but don't cancel Christmas. That's out of bounds. So he comes back. Charles II comes back. He lasts for quite a while too. He has a really fun court. The one thing about Charles II that I want to mention really is that he was leaning towards the Catholic side as well, which is not popular. But he had a really extravagant court. He loved art and music, and he loved, showing off. He loved the pageantry. He loved the festivals. He loved showing this is what a king does. This is how a king lives. Come on over. He had tons of girlfriends. His wife, unfortunately, was unable to have a child. She was a Portuguese princess, and the queen was unable to have a child, but he refused to divorce her. Unlike Henry, who liked to chop his wife's heads off and then replace them as much as possible, Charles II refused to do this, but he didn't have his solution, which Henry probably should have done too, would have probably been better for everyone, but he had a lot of lady friends. So he ended up with something like 14 recognized children, but they were not able to be king or queen because they were not by his wife. So this means that when he dies, his brother, James II, is going to take over. James II does take over, and he's the Duke of York. And during this time, I know everybody knows New York. It was always called New Amsterdam, but when they take over, when the English defeat the Dutch and take possession of York, they take possession of New Amsterdam, they name it after James II. He's not James II yet, but the future James II. So he's the Duke of York, so New York is named after him. That's the guy. New York is named after this guy, who's a super Catholic, divine right, bumbling, incapable king, sort of like Charles I, unfortunately. So he's very much like his father, not like his brother. He becomes super unpopular very quickly, makes a lot of bad decisions. As a result, they invite this person called the Stadtholder, William of Orange. He's basically fighting a war. Basically, not completely, but he's the main part of a resistance to Catholic Europe. And Louis XIV is the Sun King. He's called the Sun King for a reason. All of Europe is just revolving. He has everything under his control. He's like a giant puppet master, except and he's controlling James II too, and Charles II too. Louis XIV was giving them money, and they were doing what he wanted to. He's basically controlling all of Europe. He either has control of it with military power, or he's controlling it with financial power or political power. Louis XIV is a fascinating person. He's called the Sun King. He's one of the greatest kings in European history, but he's French, so he's not directly related to this course, except in the sense that he had Charles and James in his pocket, and William he did not. And there was a lot of people in England. As I said, by this point, England's basically Protestant. So they really, really don't want a Catholic king. And that's the main reason that this group of people called the Immortal Seven decides to invite him, because he's married to James's daughter. James's daughter is Mary. Mary is Anglican. And William is, I guess, a future... He's a reformist. He would be, eventually his ancestors, his future children would become Dutch Reform, I guess. But he's a Protestant, and he's a reformist. So he is a much preferable choice to James II. So they essentially just, a lot of people in England desire this Protestant leader, even though he's not technically supposed to be the king. So they invite him to come over. He gets in a bunch of ships, and he comes down the channel, and he manages to get his army into England, and then to march towards London. And King James II just can't believe that his son-in-law and his daughter would actually do this. And he's not really a good leader militarily or in general. So he just, his nose starts bleeding, and then he runs away. That's the really simplified version of it. And so you end up with an army. We don't call it conquering, because there was no real battle between English and foreign invaders. It's basically just like them inviting somebody who's related to the king to come over, and him bringing an army just to make sure everybody listens to what he says. But he just marches into London, and they open the gate. And basically that's one of the things that happens in British culture is, if London opens the gate, you're good. If they close the gate, it's game over. You're in big trouble. Because London has all the financial and political power, a huge population, and an influence on the rest of, the island, right up to Scotland. So they let him in, and he becomes the new King of England. So he's the stadtholder of the Netherlands, and he's the King of England at the same time. And basically, he needs money badly. He wants to continue the war against, he wants to protect the Netherlands with English money and English ships and military power, the army. And so when he becomes the king, he has to negotiate with Parliament. And Parliament basically says, we'll make you the king, even though King James ran away to France, and we could invite him back, but we won't if you give us more power, if you give up some of your sovereignty, so that you can't do things like he's basically trading some of his sovereignty, some of his power, in terms of managing the country. He gives it up to Parliament, and Parliament gives him as much money or financial support and military support and political support as he needs to fight against Louis XIV. And it basically works. So that is King James, 1688. He doesn't die. He runs away. And this is called the Glorious Revolution, right? Over here. So that's 1688. That got rubbed out a little bit. But 1688 is a key event, because that is the point, back to what my student asked. That is the point where you can see from that point that England is not an absolute monarchy in any way. Never again. So Parliament is called or dismissed. It's under the power of the king. However, from 1689, from the next year, when King William becomes the king, Parliament meets every year without any interruption until today. So right to 2020. Unbroken line. They are never dismissed or broken up. They meet consistently. Sometimes they are dismissed and broken up, but temporarily. So every year since 1688 until now, which is, that's a good 330 something years streak going, that the Parliament has met, because they are the ones that control the country. The king increasingly loses the ability to make decisions by himself. He can only do that or the Queen, in partner with the Parliament. And that's why we call it a constitutional monarchy. And that's why Canada has the Queen on their money. If you're American and you ask me again, I'm going to say it to you plainly. Yes, we have the Queen on our money. She's a figurehead, but the reason that we have her on our money, because we are a parliamentary, we have a parliamentary system that mirrors that in England, and it's based on this idea of constitutional monarchy. She signs the laws. She never says no. No king or queen has blocked a law since this time. So you can see this is the beginning of modern life in British culture. This is why it's similar to what, if you go to London now, everything's different technologically and everything, but the political system and the culture itself, it has its roots. It changes a little, but this is a slow evolution. And you can see it, the revolution, that's why it's called the Glorious Revolution. It's glorious for a number of reasons. And there's some things that are not glorious about it. But the main thing is it doesn't, no people die. It's a revolution without violence. So some people, again, would say, well, the Industrial Revolution is not a revolution because it's not fast. And the Glorious Revolution is not a revolution because it's not violent. But there is a sudden change, and that is the key point, right? In the Glorious Revolution, there's a sudden change. In the Industrial Revolution, you can't see that. But the difference between the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the stages is so dramatic, even though it's slow, that people argue that it's a revolution too. So that brings us to, we got King William. He dies 1702. Yeah. After him, he doesn't manage to have children either. So you got Queen Anne. And Queen Anne, she's Mary's sister. I know this is complicated. Don't worry about Queen Anne because I can't include her, although she's very interesting. But during her reign, the war is won. Louis XIV basically runs out of money, even though he has ridiculous amounts of money. He eventually can't keep up. Even him at the center of everything. So he basically has to give up trying to conquer Europe. Only Napoleon will do what he didn't manage to do. But in some ways, Louis XIV had more influence over Europe for a longer period of time than Napoleon did. So eventually, though, basically the English, with the help of the Irish and the Scottish and the Dutch, they succeed on stopping France's expansion. And in part of that process is Scotland becomes a junior partner in a relationship, and this is controversial too. But basically Scotland tries to become a colonial power and tries to trade and compete with England, and they can't. And England should be blamed for that because they have an advantage. They're kind of in between Scotland and a lot of these places, and Scotland needs England to cooperate in order for them to be able to succeed at their business endeavors and their colonial attempts. But England does not. In fact, they intentionally don't help them, and in some ways they sabotage them. So people die, and people have economic hardship, and Scotland is running out of money. They don't have enough food. So then when England says, tell you what, we'll just forget about all this money you owe, and we'll just help you, and we'll make one country together, and you guys can send down a bunch of representatives, and you can participate in our government, as a partner, and represent yourselves in the parliamentary process. A lot of Scottish people are not enthusiastic about this, and they still lots of people regret it to this day, but essentially this was too good of a deal considering the circumstances for them to reject. So in 1707, the Act of Union created the United Kingdom of Great Britain, of England and Scotland. And the Kingdom of Ireland is not part of that union. That's another story. So I'll stay out of that one for now. But hopefully we can work that in a future lecture. So that brings us up to the 18th century. Thank goodness. I hope that I don't talk too much for you to be able to digest. But I think the best thing to do is try and do 30 minutes. I don't want to skip too much. I want you to understand the big picture. But remember, sometimes I do go off topic. You can probably tell. You don't have to know about Toyotomi Hideyoshi. If you're from another country or Korean, doesn't matter. You don't have to know that Imjin War is 1592 or that it ended in 1598, or any of those. That's has nothing to do with this course. I'm just trying to illustrate, try to make you understand better the important things. The important thing, of course, is that Cromwell was a bad guy who did terrible things to Irish Catholics, which they blame him for still. It's still too soon to really attempt to cover up any of his weak points because of the terrible memories that still persist. Okay? So, remember, let's focus on the main points that I said, like the 5 points. I always kind of emphasize these things. Remember, you don't have to know all the dates here, but these events are important. You need to know the key ideas. You need to know the key ideas. The colonization of America, Jamestown, happened in 1607, but that's only there just to give perspective. Some of these things are happening at the same time, but this course is also topically organized. So we're not talking about America right now. So although James, under King James, which we talked about, there are a lot of things that happen in North America. I stayed away from that because we're going to come back to it next week when we talk about the Revolutionary War. So we went forward to 1707, and we're going to rewind right back to 1492. And because Columbus and that event was so significant, it's just a pivot point. And then we're going to bring us back up. So there's going to be like an instant replay from the American perspective next week. And then both British and American cultures will go forward in parallel. But we will mostly focus on America for the rest of the course, except for the Industrial Revolution. And that, my students, is the end for today. There is no assignment this week. You don't have to worry about that. And I also revealed to you that there is no midterm scheduled. So I need you to pay attention and keep attending all these lectures and keep up. Don't fall behind because that's going to be significant. And I am going to record tomorrow a short update which will be uploaded to all of the classes through my website. So thank you for listening and bearing with me as we went through this 17th century journey. I hope some of it was interesting. Like I said, the email from the one student, there are others, but that particular one really made me feel good about what we're trying to, what we're trying to do in educating you about these things this semester. So keep doing what you're doing, and I'll talk to you on Monday, and we'll start another chapter. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.